My name is Marlette Hazlett, and I am a representative from the PCST Scientific Committee, and I know we have others from that group among us here today as well. And the reason we're joining here today is that our conference is going to take place in Rotterdam next April. And we wanted to sort of build some momentum towards that event. The theme of the event is common ground, creating common ground. And of course, that could take a lot of different meanings. The local organizing committee, of whom John is a member, they came up with these 5 sub-themes. And so what we thought would be really advantageous to everybody attending the conference is, what do we mean when we talk about these 5 sub-themes? And so the acronym forms VOICE, and I'm going to let John and our speakers kind of dig into that more carefully. I want to thank you again for your flexibility with our sort of technical hiccup. I'm really pleased to see the turnout that we're getting. For those of the ones that weren't able to adjust their schedules, we'll have this available as a recording. So very much appreciate your flexibility up front. It is my pleasure to introduce John. John and I met in Rotterdam last spring, I believe. It's been some months. He very graciously agreed to partner in organizing this. And he has definitely done the lion's share of the work. He identified the speakers and made sure that they were specialists in the areas that we're going to be talking about. John is a science communicator by profession and by education, and he is a dad in the evenings and the mornings and the daytime, and he's got young kids, which always is just really exciting, because I know that really spreads him a bit thin some days. But he's a pleasure to work with, and I know he's going to lead us in a great panel this morning, or for me this morning. And I know we've got people in the evening and the afternoons elsewhere in the world. So with that, let me just make sure I haven't forgotten anything. Recording. Oh, please place your questions in the chat, and between John and I, we'll make sure that we'll do our best to reach as many as we can. And John, I'm going to turn it over to you now, and I'll start monitoring the waiting room.
John, if there's time, can you make me a co-host so I can share the screen if I want to show a slide?
Oh, fantastic. I think you should be able to share if it's green. So hopefully, hopefully that should work. That's fine. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for attending this PCST webinar. It's one of 3 that we've organized in the run-up to the conference next year in Rotterdam. So my name's John Chase. I'm currently working at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And it is my pleasure to introduce our 5 speakers for today. Each of them has particular expertise and experience in each one of our sub-themes, which is values, openness, inclusiveness, collaboration or collaborative working, and also expertise. I probably won't say too much more about myself, because it's not about me, it is about all of you and how we can open up this discussion and really think about how we can create common ground in science communication. So first up on our list of speakers is Sherry Seethaler. She teaches research communication and directs education initiatives at the University of California, San Diego, and was the Science Questions Answered columnist for the San Diego Union Tribune for more than 7 years. She has authored multiple books that have been translated into several languages. Her forthcoming book, Beyond the Sage and on the Stage, is a guide to developing the knowledge, skills, and habits of mind to communicate effectively about complex issues in challenging times. So today, Sherry will be providing her perspective on the relevance of values in creating common ground with within science communication. So with that, I'd like to hand the screen over to you, Sherry.
Great. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me. Just sharing my screen here. Hopefully that will pop up very shortly. Are we all good now? We have my screen? Okay. So as John mentioned, I'll be speaking about values, and John initially reached out to me because he saw this paper that I had worked on with our Institute for Practical Ethics and Research Communications program at UC San Diego. And it is a paper where we developed a set of competencies around values, decision-making, uncertainty, and diversity of voices, with the goal of getting beyond, as John mentioned, the title of my forthcoming book, Beyond the Sage on the Stage, model of science communication and improving communication training. So the paper sets out sort of this big picture, but today I really want to zoom in so that we can have a good conversation. I'm going to look at 3 specific findings in the research literature about values, and then say a few words about how we might actually apply them to the goal of creating common ground. So the first is the finding that an emphasis on difference increases polarization, and that you can get this vicious cycle occurring when a small values divide between 2 groups, whether they're political groups, religious groups, demographic groups, what have you. As more and more attention is called to that values divide, the divide starts to get bigger, and it becomes ideologically entrenched. And an example of that is work by Nisbet and Markowitz that found that before the 2004 presidential election in the States, it was not, embryonic stem cell research was not a wedge issue, but it was made into a wedge issue by political elites, and then that was exacerbated through this cycle of polarization. The second finding is that we are actually all mixes of identities, and different values come to the fore when we're wearing different identity hats. So we might be members of a political party or religious group, demographic, but we're also, we have certain hobbies. We might be parents. And so there was research that showed by Klar, it was published in the Journal of Politics in 2013, showing that if you bring people into a lab and you ask them to read about a policy and you kind of subtly remind them of their political affiliation before they read it, they interpret what they read in terms of their political affiliation. If instead you bring them in and you subtly remind them of their parent identity, now they're more willing to oppose the policies of their political party if it's more consistent with their parent identity. And the third is that different decisions arise from the same values. And of course, the reverse is true. And I published a paper a few years back about shades of gray in vaccination decision making, where I talked about how you can't necessarily look at the outcome of a decision and decide how that decision came about. Okay, so last slide. What does that mean for creating common ground? Starting with the values divide, this cycle of polarization. One thing we can do is to avoid triggering language. So here in the US, the right does not like the word taxes and the left does not like the word deregulation. If I want to find a common entry point, I would try to use neutral language. Another way to find an entry point is to use value consistent frames. So an example that has been used to talk about environmental issues with religious conservatives is the frame of creation care. And so that is a value consistent way of framing environmental issues and creating an entry point. The second was this issue of us all wearing multiple identity hats. Well, that gives us the opportunity to connect through a shared identity. Instead of sort of butting heads, we now have the opportunity to say, oh, you're a parent, I'm a parent too. Let's talk about that. Let's highlight our shared values. That process then starts to build trust, and then we can start to have conversations around that. And the last was this idea of the values and the decisions, not that necessarily the values predestining the decisions. And so I think we really need to start shifting the focus from problems to solutions. We have a lot of doomsday scenarios. There's a lot of doom and gloom. And we know that you don't necessarily need to agree on all aspects of a problem in order to agree on a solution. A solution may also solve multiple problems, one that you care about and one that I care about. It's also a solution. Another example is a solution to an environmental problem might be something that we can all get around because it valorizes human ingenuity. Even if your values are consistent with solving the problem, and I would say maybe even especially if your values are consistent with solving a problem, you have this phenomenon called the ostrich effect, where if people feel that there is no hope for a solution, they want to stick their heads in the sand. And so this option of really moving the focus from problems to solutions can start to engender hope. And that hope can make us all, I think, want to work together better. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Openness.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sherry. Right on time, in fact. That was really kept succinct. So next up, who we are going to move over to the topic of openness. And we have Nishant Chakravorty from India. Now, Dr. Chakravorty is a physician scientist by training and leads the regenerative medicine lab at School of Medical Science and Technology, IIT in Kharagpur. He is an editorial board member of the journals Molecular Biology Reports, PLOS ONE, and Frontiers in Medical Technology, and also serves as a reviewer for several international journals. He's a strong supporter of the open science movement, which should not be confused with the open access movement. And recently, he co-authored a manuscript entitled Open Science: Challenges, Possible Solutions, and the Way Forward. So today, Nishant will be providing his perspective on the relevance of openness in creating common ground within science communication. So with that, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that wonderful introduction. I hope I'm audible properly. Let me check my slides. And I believe my slides are visible as well. So yeah, I mean, firstly, thank you so much for providing me with this platform. And when John actually reached out to me regarding this topic, it was something that was not something that I had even pondered that I would be talking about at some time in the near future. But definitely, we had written a paper in the proceedings of the Indian National Science Academy recently, where we discussed about open science in general. That definitely leads us to the question of openness in open science and how far we should reach with the so-called openness. So if you look at the paradigm of open science, it does not only cover open access publications, which, as John also highlighted in his introduction, that is something that I want to keep them separate. So we have open access publications as an integral part of open science, but in addition to that, we have several different components, which includes open methodology, where people and scientists will be sharing their ideologies and the ways they conduct their research, or the result that is generated in maybe the raw format as well, in the form of open data through the different sharing platforms. Or for that matter, we keep accessing several different softwares nowadays, open source softwares, or open peer review, which is already in place in most of the journal publications that we see, and different types of teaching resources in the form of open resources that we have. So of course, everything leads to eventually the way we communicate science in some form or other, maybe to our students or maybe to the public at large. So why do we think that this is important? Just let's have a look at some of the facts. So if you see, journal publications over the years have been increasing to great lengths, and they have probably increased to the levels which we have never imagined so far. And this is something that I took out from a publication by Meadcroft in 2020, where it was being shown how the publication subscription charges have increased more than the rates of inflation and the number of times it has increased. So if you look at the best publications that we know of, Nature and Science for that matter, they have increased more than 100 times. New England Journal of Medicine, which is considered like amongst the like a Bible for medicine, so it's close to 250 times. So we are basically paying the price for openness, or open access, as they say. And clearly, if you look at another publication, which was also published in Nature in 2013, they highlighted how the publication fees or the open access charges increase with the influence of that journal's impact that we have.
So Nishant, we just lost you for a second there. So just that last 10 seconds.
Yeah, sure. So the challenges that we look at are associated costs, who should bear the expenses of open access, quality issues, concerns of predatory publications, exorbitant profit margins, publication inequality. And there are several different challenges that we need to look at. So I would probably leave this with the closing remarks, which leads us to the question that to what extent we should open up. So let's open up this debate. We need to understand the facts first before we open up open science as such as a way out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nishant. That was wonderful. And I believe, yeah, I think the slides were advancing. Okay, did everyone see that? Okay, fantastic. So next up, we are going to move on to a speaker that is from the UK. And who I discovered through, again, doing my searches online and discovered a paper that she'd written for Falling Walls. And I was like, that should be someone who should get involved. So next up, we have Rockia Baloumi, who is a PhD researcher of Science and Technology Studies, STS, at University College London. Her work brings key concepts from STS and studies of science advice together with Black feminist and post-intersectional theory to explore the relationship between science advice policy, social inequalities, and publics in the UK. Rockia is also co-chair of Science London, a voluntary organisation who hosts events and creates resources to support scientists and science communicators to employ equitable practice in their work. In 2021, she collaborated with Falling Walls Engage to develop a perspective review, which offered an introduction to academic perspectives on the inclusive science engagement landscape and an overview of 5 international case studies of exemplary inclusive practice. So today, Rockia will be providing her perspectives on the relevance of inclusiveness in creating common ground within science communication. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, John. And again, thank you for including me as part of this discussion. It's really great to be here. So as John mentioned, I will be talking about inclusiveness in science communication and thinking about how do we effectively steer towards inclusive practice in science communication. And as many of us do, I thought about this in terms of the 2 faces of science. So science as a body of knowledge and as social process. So I'll be thinking about it in terms of science communication research and inclusiveness there, as well as in practice. So quite fortuitously, last week, the Journal of Science Communication released their 20th anniversary collection, which was actually titled Looking Back and Looking Forward. And a paper from Emily Dawson and other colleagues at UCL, I thought really captured some of the issues around inclusiveness within science communication research itself. So often I think within science communication research, we kind of take values like inclusiveness for granted now as something that is always already part of the conversation. But their paper draws attention to the powerful politics that are embedded in science communication research itself and the sometimes narrow epistemological frame within which we are working. And the fact that because of this, we are often reproducing in the way that we conduct science communication research some of the exclusionary practices that we were seeing in science more generally that made kind of these outreach processes necessary in the first place. So they draw to attention the models of science communication practice, which are developed in the global north, tend to dominate science communication research and often don't reflect practices that are taking place elsewhere. And I think this quote as well was quite useful for me when thinking about this. They say the research focus on mainstream formulations of science communication work to the detriment of our understanding of other forms of engagement with science, including engagement that flies below the radar of the dominant, visible, and explicitly valued formats, publics, and topics. So for me, in terms of inclusiveness in science communication research, this shows up in the way in citation practices, and it shows up in the way that we look for examples of where good science communication or inclusive science communication takes place. And this also seemed to be something that the journal editors reflect on as well. They talk about, so in the opening article of the anniversary collection, they talk about the journal as wanting to provide space or committing to provide space for more than just articles. So things like practice insights, essays, commentary sets, and reviews of books and conferences. And they reflect on how this commitment to being inclusive in the way we research science communication may have impacted lowered the impact factor of the journal. And I thought that was quite interesting and, you know, something to reflect on as a field, why being inclusive in the way that we conduct science communication research should be considered less impactful or less valuable. And I think this this goes to questions I think that are linked to the way academia functions in general, and is probably a wider conversation for another time. But those were some of the key reflections that I took from that in terms of the way we conduct science communication research, and the fact that we can't take values like inclusiveness for granted, and often we are replicating exclusionary practices even as we are researching inclusiveness in science communication. So as John mentioned, I was lucky enough to partner with Falling Walls in Berlin to write this perspective review in 2021. And there I was able to look at the practice side. So as well as the research side, to look at the practice side of science communication, was able to kind of put some of those things to do with citation practices and where we look for best practice examples into this work that I was doing. And they gave me the space to kind of look beyond the literature and to speak to people that may not be tied to like formalized funding, and to really engage our community more generally to see where they thought the kind of most community-led, grassroots inclusive practice was taking place. And I got a really great response and was able to speak to 5 practitioners internationally. So I spoke to colleagues from Egypt, Scotland, India, England, and Portugal. And some of the things we talked about included barriers to inclusion, and they reflected on the fact that identifying barriers isn't always enough, and that the practical barriers, so things like cost or geography for people engaging with science, are important factors, but we should also be considering the kind of embodied barriers that people experience. So feelings of belonging being just as important as those physical barriers that they identify in their work. We also talked about there being more to inclusive practice in science communication than just dialogue. And I think this goes back to the kind of some of the dominant models that are created in the research, being very discursive and wanting to move from kind of deficit to dialogue framings of science communication, which are really important, but are not the only ways. And a focus on those is to the detriment of being kind of more imaginative and creative when we're thinking about inclusive practice. One other thing that we talked about was the fact that we often cite empowerment as an aim for inclusive practice, but that part of that and wanting to empower publics with science communication should also be accepting non-engagement as a valid choice. And if we're unable to make space for non-engagement, and if we feel like we're doing everything right and communities still don't want to engage or individuals don't want to engage, if we're not able to accept that, then we should be questioning who we're really doing this for and if our aims are kind of aligning with what we say they are, which can, it can be challenging because often if we are tied to particular types of funding, you have to provide certain metrics and you have to show what success looks like, and often that is just engagement. And so then as part of the conversation, we talked about inclusive practice needing us to change what success looks like. And that success can't just come from us, it has to be what success would look like for that community and what they need. And the importance of building the aims and objectives of a science communication, particularly inclusive science communication projects, around the communities that we're engaging, and being willing to change what those aims and objectives are, and being flexible. And again, to align this with how difficult that can be when you're trying to apply for funding, is trying to build that space into our funding applications. And I can't speak for all funding bodies, but I will say that in the UK, funders have started to be a bit more accepting of that, and the accepting of the need to be flexible and the time it takes to build trust with communities when you're trying to do inclusive practice. But I can't say the extent to which that is a reflection on the adaptations we needed to make in the pandemic, or the fact that EDI has been much more on the public agenda, and whether that's going to be a permanent change or just something that we're seeing in the short term. And then the final thing, and reflection from the conversations I was having with these great practitioners internationally, was about inclusive practice benefiting everyone. So not just the historically marginalized groups that we are often trying to target. And a really good example of that was the project that took place in Portsmouth, the Tactile Universe, which was engaging blind students with science communication. But then they also talked about the benefits that they had for other members of the class, other people in the school. So seeing inclusive practice is something that can benefit everyone. And I think I'll leave that there because that might be my 5 minutes. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rockia. That was wonderful, and yes, and so much interesting things coming on. I'm just trying now to think, how am I going to bring this all together? Because as I hear you speaking, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, oh. So yeah, this is amazing, and I hope anybody who's any of our attendees has got any other questions, and please do type the questions in the chat, or feel free to just put your hand up afterwards to answer any questions, because we will have about 20 minutes or so to have a great conversation about this as well. Okay, so next up, we want to move to our next speaker. And our next speaker, her name is Ava Kalmar, and she's a biologist and a science communication professional. She's interested in the communication processes embedded in scientific or technology-related collaborations. She's also interested in the ideas represented in the infrastructure school of open science movement. So today, Ava will be providing her perspectives on the relevance of collaboration in creating common grounds within science communication. So over to you, Ava.
Thank you very much. When I was preparing for today, I was just thinking back to my memories regarding PCST. And the first conference I was attending was in New Zealand, Dunedin, and the theme of it was Science, Stories and Society. And well, we all know great storytellers who are really representing science communication to the major audience. And this is how we are usually identified as well. So if I am telling someone that we are working on science communication, then they are immediately telling all kinds of names we are familiar with, who are really great in dissecting scientific knowledge to people. And we always have to correct the people that, okay, that is science communication, but we are interested in other aspects as well. That might be because I'm not a great storyteller myself, but of course we are all different. We all come from different backgrounds, and our professions and abilities, possibilities, interests, and values determine what we actually do at the current moment and how we do that. And there are different trends in the education of science communication, which are going into the direction that, of course, we need to train scientists how to do it correctly, how we have to inform scientists as well how to do science communication. But that leads me to the question that do we need actually to have scientists who are all communication experts, who are all communication scientists? In my view, it's not the case. And well, I look at science communication from the perspective of science, of team science. And that means that we actually have to take science communication as a team effort. And if we take the perspective of the science of team science, then we are actually looking at the different subjects from the perspectives of what kind of teams are there, what kind of teams should we have, is that the ideal combination of people what we have. And coming back to the theme of this particular conference, values, inclusion, openness, collaboration, and expertise, and I think these are really crucial and element aspects of science communication. In my view, science communication should be an open gremium where we investigate all kinds of opinions, all kinds of interests, and all kinds of different standpoints of all the people who are involved in the particular problem. Because I also, if I have to come back to Rockia's question, why do we do science? I really think that the answer is that we have to take society and societal issues into the picture. We cannot do science for the sake of just getting a knowledge broader and deeper. And for that, to be able to solve these kind of complex problems, we need to take the stakeholders along. And that's, of course, we all know that's the public engagement part of science communication. We need to actually train scientists, in my view, to be able to ask questions and to be able to reach out to those kind of people who are usually not taken along, whose opinions are not listened to. This is also part of science communication. But we also have to take along those people who can actually do something and change things. So the governmental people, municipalities, all those people who are involved in policy management, they also have to be part of understanding the problem, the underlying issues, not just creating the solutions. And we also have to take along those stakeholders who are usually just part of the analysis, the problem analysis, the citizens, the users of different technologies, also in creating the solution. So in my view, science communication is a big challenge of creating teams that include professionals who are representing different expertise, so coming from different disciplinary backgrounds, but also then other stakeholder groups. And we need to create methodologies to be able to work in this environment. It is possible. It needs knowledge from different fields, and it needs to understand how to manage the team dynamics to come up with a working solutions for these. So in my view, science communication is creating a common ground, in that sense that we listen to people, we are open to all kinds of views and perspectives, and we are opening up to those people who can come to solution, who can create and design solutions for these problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ava. That was wonderful. And we see there's a few questions coming through, so please do keep them coming, and we will field them to our speakers afterwards. So on to our final specialist speaker today, and he will be talking about expertise, and is actually from a place where I live in the Netherlands, Cardiff, and so I've met some of his work before. So Harry Collins is the Distinguished Research Professor at Cardiff University. He's also an elected Fellow of the British Academy and winner of the Bernal Prize for Social Studies of Science. His almost 25 books cover, among other things, sociology of scientific knowledge, artificial intelligence, the nature of expertise, tacit knowledge, and technology in sport. So today, Harry will be providing his perspective on the relevance of expertise in creating common ground with science communication. So over to you, Harry. Oh, well, we think we've lost your voice.
Oh, there we go. How's that?
Oh, yes, we're back.
Is that okay?
Perfect.
Okay, well, as you say, as you will see, I'm pretty old. And as you pointed out, with my 25 books and lots of articles, I've got a lot of experience, but I've never done a 5-minute talk before, nor listened to a whole series of 5-minute talks and been expected to respond. So I don't really know what to do. And I think what I'll do is try and irritate everybody as much as possible by taking a completely different viewpoint to the one that's applied here, and tell you that where I come from, where I get into all this, is being very worried about what is happening in Trump's America and related countries. And what worries me is that the difference between truth and lies is being eroded. And among these differences, I mean, science is being eroded. It's never in the interest of a populist and would-be fascist to accept that there is truth in expertise, because that's going to present problems for them when they try to present themselves as governing as the embodiment of the will of the people. In fact, if you want to make sure that this kind of government doesn't collapse into fascism, you have to have the standard sorts of checks and balances that you have in democracies, which means that those who have lost an election still have some say and have some rights. And what I've been arguing in the last 2 or 3 of these books and lots of papers is that one of the checks and balances in modern societies is science. Science can stop people like Donald Trump just claiming, as they feel like it, that lockdowns aren't necessary because COVID-19 is just like the flu, and that masks don't work, and that maybe vaccines don't work, and thus get a lot of votes from the vaccine deniers. So in other words, what I'm going to say, as opposed to the implication of what the other people were saying, is that science is and should be an elite business, and the details of it cannot be understood by anybody except the elite. Now, I've spent 45 years working in a particular field of physics called gravitational wave detection, where this became utterly clear. I worked very, very hard and managed to understand gravitational wave physics, and it took me about 10 years, immersed in that community, continually involved in discourse with that community. Now, in 2015, the first gravitational wave was detected, according to the scientists. They then took 5 months to try out every possible doubt that they could think of that this wasn't a gravitational wave. And then in 2016, they announced that they had discovered the first ever gravitational wave in a big conference. But shortly afterwards, another group, quite a respectable group from Copenhagen, said that all their calculations were wrong and they hadn't discovered a gravitational wave after all. Now, that's a problem for open science because the group from Copenhagen didn't really understand what was going on. But as soon as you open up science in the way that, say, Nishant was implying that it should be opened up, you're going to open it up to all sorts of people who don't understand the immense difficulties and immense subtleties of a scientific field. And you're going to open it up to conspiracy theories. I mean, we know in the social studies of science how conspiracy theories work. And conspiracy theories work just by starting from a different set of assumptions that the mainstream scientists work on. And it's difficult to justify that difference. In fact, you've simply got to be elitist. Now, don't be too scared of being elitist, because you're all elitists. You're elitist, well, if you're in the UK, you were elitist when a set of judges decided that Boris Johnson could not just go for Brexit without consulting Parliament. We all said, no, you elite judges, tell us that he's wrong, that the Constitution says he has to consult Parliament. And they did. And we were all delighted to have the help of this elite, though none of us knew the law in any kind of detail. And that's what the rule of law depends on, elitism. And that's what science depends on, elitism. And I'll stop there in the hope that I've caused enough trouble.
Thank you, Harry. And I can honestly say, anytime we bring politics into any discussion, trouble is often caused. So, but thank you, Harry. And I am going to start with a question, though. So we've heard from all of our speakers on a different one of the 5 different themes. And I'd like to start with a question for all of you. And I'll maybe start with Harry, and then we'll work our way back through the themes in reverse order, which might start off a bit confusing, but we'll give it a go. So there's a well-known and reported gap between research and practice. And this is a classic thing. And I think this is really important because from the researcher's point of view, they will have particular values, they'll be inclusive in their own way, and obviously the different voice acronyms work towards the different areas for researchers, and the same for practitioners. But I'd like to ask you all, how do you feel that the problem lies between research and practice? Do you think it's a problem of creating common grounds between the two? And if so, what could we do to bridge that gap? So from your own perspective, maybe on your own sub-theme, and then maybe from your own opinion, could you briefly maybe respond to how you think we could create common grounds between researchers and practitioners, perhaps?
I'm sorry, but I'm not sure that I understand the problem. Could you give me an example of where there'd be a tension between research and practice?
Yeah, so for example, researchers in science communication often produce a lot of theories and a lot of examples of how we should act as science communicators within society. The problem is that practitioners don't generally look at the research being produced by researchers. I personally, as a practitioner, put that down to, we don't speak the same language as researchers. When you're writing research, often it seems to be written to other researchers, not for practitioners in mind. So there appears to be this widening gap between what researchers say should be done and can be done within science communication, and how practitioners actually do science communication. Now, a following point I was going to say, but I'll probably say it here, is that researchers have an area of expertise and practitioners have different areas of expertise as well. So I'd probably say for you, how do you feel that we could create common grounds between these different specialities, the speciality of research in science communication and the different specialities of practice in science communication?
Yeah, I'm sorry, John, I don't think I can answer that because I've never done any research on researchers in science communication.
No, that's fine. And that is a thing that we recommend that people say. And I was also reading about, you said people shouldn't stretch beyond their area of expertise. And so I'd expect you to give that answer, to be honest, which is why I kind of started with you first. But after a bit of thought, and I'll say any of our speakers, in fact, instead of asking each of you to comment, I'd like to see if any of you would like to offer any perspective on how to bridge the gap between researchers and practice in science communication.
I think if I can come back to other topics than mine. So if we take open science perspectives, I think we also can think about then what is not going well with science. So then questioning all kinds of basic questions. Rockia mentioned, why do you do science? What is the basic need why we do that? But I think how we do science is also a crucial question. And maybe the current practices are not good enough. Maybe we need to involve practitioners. Maybe we need more discussion. And one way to do that, there are some professions, like for architecture, this is not really a big question. So there are researchers who are actually researching what are then the urban development practices, and there are the practitioners. They talk to each other. It's not so rare that they are informing each other and creating common conferences. So there are possibilities, and we have to be creative with that. I think we need to reach out to each other.
Fantastic. And would any other speakers like to?
Oh, yeah, I'll let Sherry go first, and I'll go after.
Yeah, I think I like to speak to that because it relates to the work that we did, that we published in the Science Values and Science Communication paper. I think it is a real problem that science communication trainers for a lot have not read the literature. They haven't been trained necessarily in research methods. They may not even be aware that the field of science and technology studies exists. So that was one of the things we called for in our papers, to really have coalitions. I mean, getting back to this idea of collaboration, of having different people in our research communications program. We have expertise from theater, from communication, and also from science education. And so bringing that together, we really see where different people's expertise, we each have expertise in a particular thing. So I think it's really hard. I think this is true in science education as well. It's not, I mean, these are separate fields, right? Science communication, science education, I work in both. And it's the same situation where there's a ton of theory being produced and it doesn't necessarily actually influence practice, because the people doing the training or the people doing the teaching aren't necessarily the same people doing this research. So I do think more reaching out to colleagues at your institution, like who's doing the training? Do you have communications teams, like working with them, maybe inviting them to a seminar, letting them know that there's all this research out there. So maybe they'll start to have a conversation, come to you for advice, or just, you know, letting people know that it's available. So yeah, I think we need to do a better job as researchers also of, you know, like you said, there's a language divide of giving recommendations for practice that are actually something that somebody could take into a training. So.
Thank you, Sherry. And Rockia?
Yeah, thank you. I think both Eva and Sherry's ideas are great in terms of kind of collaboration, and would completely agree. I think in order for those to work, we might have to challenge Harry's perspective about elitism a little bit, because as you say, part of the reason maybe that practitioners aren't engaging is because of that elite attitude, that they think that this is knowledge that they wouldn't understand, or knowledge that they can't engage with because we aren't writing it for them. So I think if we want that to work and we want collaboration to work, then we might have to challenge those ideas about keeping science elite, because otherwise how do we bring other people in if we are creating an atmosphere where we're kind of already tacitly suggesting that this knowledge is beyond them? even though they are the people on the ground that are doing this work. And they probably have some really valuable knowledge that could help inform the way we research science communication. Because as I mentioned, a lot of what we're doing in the way we research it is just reproducing a lot of the exclusionary patterns that we see in science anyway. So yeah, I would say that that's a big part of it. But also that from speaking to people who are practitioners, increasingly there are these kind of boundary operators, people who are researchers and practitioners as well, and maybe utilizing them as that kind of central node between theory and practice and kind of making more of what they do. But yeah, I think if we want the collaboration to work, we can't be shutting people out. Otherwise, how will we get them to engage? And the same problems that we see in science communication and people not engaging will just be happening within our own community as well.
Fantastic.
See what people think about that.
Thank you, Rockia. And Harry, I'd like you to respond to some questions about elitism. And we'll check Nishant's response now, so then you can kind of respond to all of the different ideas at the same time. And we've also had a comment from Dr. AP Jayaraman, who said, I agree with Harry that scientific research is essentially elitist, having worked in nuclear science and technology for 50 years. So we'd love to hear some of the other panelists' views on this. So please, Nishant, go ahead.
Thanks, John. I kind of actually agree with most of the panelists, and especially with Harry as well, with his comment. Maybe I would probably not like to use the word elitist, of course, because that has a kind of a connotation in a different manner. But of course, the expertise is something that should be considered. And I think what he was referring to in terms of the conspiracy theories that keep building up all the time around science, and that is primarily the reason why scientists and experts should be the people who should speak about science, and in a manner which should be more communicable to the people, in the sense that they make it more easy for them to understand rather than using scientific jargon most of the times. Nowadays, we do see a lot of these flash presentations and short presentations of scientific research by scholars. So they are also a way of connecting to the society in some way. Of course, you cannot communicate the entire research that you have been doing over the years in a very short span, and just like even in today's discussion that we are having in a 5-minute discussion. But these are steps, short steps that we can possibly think of taking forward in a way so that we are able to kind of contribute to reduce the conspiracy theories that keep cropping up all the time. Thank you.
Please, Harry, would you like to respond to any of the comments so far?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult problem because, and the way I'm used to thinking about it is all kinds of different levels of understanding. So, and there are different levels of understanding which are attainable in different topics. And then, we actually developed a test for levels of understanding, equivalent to the Turing test. The famous Turing test for a test of whether a computer is intelligent. You have a computer and a person, and you have a judge, and the judge asks questions, and if you can't tell the difference between the computer and the person, then you have to say the computer is intelligent. So we developed this thing called the Imitation Game, where we do the same things for members of expert groups and non-members of expert groups, and see if one can pass for the other. Now, I tried it on myself to see if I could pass as a gravitational wave physicist at one point, and much to my astonishment, I did pass actually rather well. But it took me about 10 years to get to that point. And then I have to ask myself the question, what chance does a science journalist have of getting to the same level of understanding that I got to after 10 years? Because the science journalist just doesn't have that much time. Okay. And then when you get to science journalism, of course, a lot of it is just repeating press releases that somebody passes out without any understanding at all. It's just turning a handle and producing a press release. What good is that doing? And then let's get to the real top scientists who do their best to produce a public understanding of science. Let's take, and this is where I'm going to make myself really unpopular with a lot of people, Let's take Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, which is a bestseller and is on lots of people's shelves. But nobody understands a single word of it. Honestly, let me assure you. Well, maybe there's a few physicists who do, but hardly anybody who's got it on their shelf understands what it's about. So it's serving the same function as the Latin Bible once served. Now, is that what you want from science communication? I don't know. It seems to me that that's going to encourage conspiracy theories, because anybody's going to be able to think they have a handle on it, whereas they don't. And the point at which it should worry you is when you get to vaccination. Because, one of the things that I got onto this theme was the revolt against mumps, measles, and rubella vaccine, where lots of parents decided they had the right to reject the mumps, measles, and rubella vaccine, and lots of journalists went along with them because they wanted a nice balanced story between the scientists and the parents. And the net result of it was a lot of kids caught measles, and some of those were maimed and died. And, it's a hard topic, and you can't get around it just by saying, well, let's have more democracy and openness.
So this is really, really very interesting, and thank you for everybody's comments. Because when we talk about creating common grounds, I pointed out the different sort of gap between, or perceived gap between, researchers and practitioners. But obviously, as science communicators, there is a classic place in which we are trying to create common grounds, and that's between scientific knowledge and scientists and the public, and also politicians, which is just one different variation of the publics. And so I have a question here from Carlo Gubitosa, and it's mainly oriented towards Dr. Seethaler, but I'll ask it and let Sherry answer first, and then if anyone else would like to add. And the question is, what about the value sharing attempts facing open hostility or even science denial on the other side of the conversation? What are the best practices to keep open a minimum communication channel in this kind of situation?
Yeah, so the first thing I want to say to that is that you always need to prioritize self-care. So there are times when somebody is not engaging in good faith. There are trolls on the internet, all of that. You don't have to always engage if that's the situation. But there are a lot of times, like we're talking about science communication as if it's only journalism, but it's not. Like in the doctor's office, there is communication that's going on. And so one thing we want to, with respect to the vaccination, we saw a real shift in America. Again, vaccination became political. But in 2017, the Pew Trust put out a report looking at vaccination and who's refusing childhood vaccines. There was no political difference. This was not a division along party lines. So there's a small percentage of parents on each side who was refusing vaccination. So it's just a reminder that these things that seem really political, seem really entrenched, are not necessarily. The same with climate change. Again, we talk as if there's like all these climate deniers out there, but if you really dig down, there are some people who say there isn't climate change, but most people agree there's climate change. They're just not really necessarily agreeing with the different policies. So I don't think the divides are always as big as we make them out to be. So that's one thing. If you're in the situation of a doctor's office and you are a doctor who's trying to convince a parent who's vaccine hesitant, right? They're just not sure. Why is the parent vaccine hesitant? At the end of the day, it's because they care about their child. Okay, so whether you agree with the decision they're making, that's different. But one starting place in that conversation is for the doctor to say, I understand that you really care about your child. To acknowledge the parent's good intentions is a step toward building trust and to starting to have that conversation. And it's true, maybe that parent won't right at that moment say, yes, I want to vaccinate my child, but now you're opening conversation. I want to give you this information, really like you to come back, next month and get your child vaccinated if you need some time to think about it. But that's the only way. You can't force them to do it. And so by opening that conversation, creating that common ground, creating that trust, that's going to at least move you in the right direction.
Fantastic, thank you. And we have had some more questions out as well. There's a question from Oh, let me see. There's a question from Petra. Sorry, I can't say your second name. Says, I love the idea of team science, and this is to Ava. Connecting science to society is a must. What is, in this context, the role of basic science?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In my view, science is providing answers. Yeah, if we talk about fundamental science, we don't know where we can use that at the moment, but it could be used somewhere else. I have been investigating different kinds of consortia, and one of them was the related to blockchain. A lot of computer scientists said that, yeah, the users don't even understand HTML basics. Why would we actually talk about blockchain? And of course, if you read the newspapers, you see that people talk about all these kind of blackmails and interaction with the dark side of the internet and correlate blockchain with that, or at least Bitcoin. So you have these kind of values and connotations and all kinds of negativity around technological innovations. And it is a really sensitive topic. So I think basic science or fundamental science is then figuring out what is going on, answering basic questions like what is there, how it is working, and then the next step is what can we use this technology or innovation or scientific information. And then if we are talking about implementing it or using it anywhere, then users, the society is involved. So then there is a great role of science communicators or people who are actually involving these stakeholders together to involve everyone who should use these.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to try some more questions. But if any of the panelists do want to respond to anyone else who speaks, please do just raise your hand and just let me go. Or if not, I'll go to another question. We have a question from Elizabeth, who was asked, to what extent is there a connection between the choice for non-engagement and the fact that there may not be searched for shared values yet? So she's just interested in reflecting on the connection between values and engagement or inclusion. So any ideas? And if you want to have a thought about it, you can have a think about it, and we can raise a different question as well. Okay, so I've got a question for the panelists, and this is the fact that science communication and practitioners are very varied. So on the one side, you have scientists who communicate, so their main skill may be science, and then they develop a skill of communication. And on the other side, you have communicators, and that's their skill, who may be interested in science. And in between, you've got the whole range of science communicators. So how do you think your area of expertise and knowledge could respond to these practitioners? How can they kind of operate, bearing in mind either their values or their expertise or openness in science and science communication, etc.? So does anyone have any ideas?
Well, I'm not quite sure if this actually bears on what you're saying, but let me just give you a slightly let me just say something which differs from what I've been saying so far. That right at this moment, I'm writing a book which includes critique of economics. And one of the things that absolutely fascinates me is the way economics is presented to the public, as though it's very easy to understand, and that any politician can give an account of an economic theory which will be understood by the public, because the public has that level of expertise. And this enables politicians to disguise policy decisions as scientific decisions. They can say, hey, we've got to have neoliberalism as the prime candidate, of course. We've got to have free markets because the economists have proved that free markets support democracy. Well, actually, if you examine economics as a science, it's very, very much more fragile than being able to prove anything like that. It's a very difficult science. But the politicians, the science communicators, present it as being something easy to understand. that at least helps you to see the danger of presenting science as being too easy to understand.
Fantastic. And I've just realized we have just about 1 minute left. And so, and like, I wish we could talk on for so much longer. And so actually, if anybody does need to pop off, please do. And we will just finish this with a last comment from each of the speakers, please, because I think it's been so valuable to have you here. And please do keep in tune for the rest of the stuff we'll be doing with PCST, because as we said, these are our sub themes and we're still got quite a lot to learn from this. We're only just beginning this conversation. So please do stay tuned and keep in contact with us so we can kind of explore this further. So could we have just a summary, brief final comment from each one of our speakers, and we'll go through in the order of VOICE. So first up, can we have Sherry on values and the final word?
Yeah, I think this was I really enjoyed this, and I think we need more of these conversations amongst ourselves. So I just really thank you for inviting me and really listening to all of your perspectives. It's really invigorating. So, and I'm really excited to see everyone's next work. Harry, I have one of your books is sitting right beside me. I've had it on my shelf for quite a while. So your book on expertise. So I'm really excited to see your next work, and same for all of you. So I think that's my final comment.
Thank you. And Nishant on openness.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you very much, John, for organizing this. It was lovely. And it's very nice to hear comments which kind of, in a way, differ from the thought process that you have been through. So that makes you understand more and a different perspective. And then you can probably think of how to go about it in the sense that can probably enhance the inclusivity in a better way. And of course, science communication has to be brought under the umbrella of the entire voice category that you have brought it in. So definitely we should work towards it, and scientists need to play a much bigger role than I think that what they have been doing so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we move over to Rockia on inclusiveness.
Yeah, so just to say thank you. I really enjoyed being part of the conversation. I guess two things that came to me throughout the discussion was one of the things that Sherry was talking about, the situation of the doctor's office, and just reflecting on a lot of the things you were talking about seem to come up. I think we have a lot of learnings from, for example, the social justice literature in general on how we build community and solidarity and meeting people where they're at, and then allowing that to be the door through which we're able to talk about science. And it's something I saw in the projects that I looked at about, the way we build that trust first and to then have those conversations about science. But also, last thing, just to go back to Harry in the conversation of science communicators to do with politics and communicating science as something that's easy to understand. I would say that part of that is kind of often, or at least in the work that I do with science advice, is often our fault, I guess, as scientists, about being really bad at communicating complexity and feeling the pressure that we get from policymakers to reach a consensus and to give sharp, simple answers that they can use in the headlines, and just not allowing ourselves to give that plurality of viewpoints and what the science says and communicating complexity. So as scientists, we need to get better at communicating that so that we don't give off this impression that these things are easy to understand and everyone can participate in. So yes, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Rockia. And if we can go over to Ava, please.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. I really love this conversation, and I recognize some of these aspects from the discussions with our students. I teach communication science theories to students, and most of these aspects are popping up in all kinds of questions mentioned here as well. So we can learn a lot from other scientific disciplines, social sciences, psychology, sociology, and so forth. And I think some of us are already trying to figure out issues that are already solved. So I think these gremia are really great to come to a conclusion that, oh yeah, you know the answer, or you have heard about it, and you can extend and learn from each other. So I think that's the basic advantage of creating common ground here.
Well, okay. I've said a lot, so I'll say only one short phrase. be careful what you wish for.
Thank you so much, Harry, and thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you to everyone who's attended and managed to catch us at the time that it's actually happened. So I've been John Chasen, representing PCST, and about this subject has been absolutely amazing. And I'd like to hand over to Marlit, please, just to close up the session. But thank you, everybody.
Thank you, John. And I just wanted to echo all my appreciation. John and I had some bumpy roads in about the hour before this meeting, and it has just gone so well. And I'm just really, really thrilled about the richness of the conversation. And we'll just keep them going. And we hope that all of you will be able to join us in Rotterdam. And meanwhile, there'll be a couple more webinars to be getting us ready. Go forth and have a great day and continue to share what we're talking about. Y'all take care.